Dewey Beach Women's Prison stood as a gray concrete fortress on the outskirts of the town of the same name, the sun blazing mercilessly, turning the courtyard into a fiery frying pan where the few inmates allowed to walk sought shade under stunted trees. The medium-security prison held about 200 women convicted of crimes ranging from fraud to manslaughter. Lucia Nesiuk watched what was happening in the courtyard through the tiny window of the laundry room where she worked for the 3rd month. She looked younger in her 28 years, thanks to her regular features and smooth, dark skin. Long fingers methodically folded the washed sheets while calculations and plans swirled in her head. 3 years of a 6-year sentence for grand fraud had passed, but Lucia wasn't going to serve the rest. She was planning for parole, and not just planning, but methodically moving toward her goal. First good behavior, then a position at the laundromat, now the next step. No one in Dewey Beach knew about her diagnosis. Lucia had been HIV positive a year before her arrest, but she managed to hide it from prison doctors by bribing a nurse at the city hospital from which her medical records were transferred. The drugs she needed to maintain her health were given to her by a friend during rare authorized visits, hiding them in a double-bottomed cosmetic bag. Lucia knew the risks, but she desperately did not want to end up in a special unit for HIV-positive people. It would mean the end of all her plans and no possibility of early release. No, she'd rather take her chances. The laundry room door opened and Claire, the middle-aged supervisor with the perpetually disgruntled face, entered. Nesiuk to the warden, now. Lucia carefully laid down the unfolded sheet and followed the warden. Her heart quickened slightly. She'd been waiting for this call, setting it up for weeks, sending an anonymous letter with information about a drug smuggling ring that one of the inmates was actually organizing. But something inside still tensed up, perhaps a self-preservation instinct warning of a dangerous game. The warden's office was in the administrative wing, an area separated from the main cell blocks by 3 grated doors with electronic locks. It smelled of polish and air-conditioned air instead of chlorine and sweat. Claire knocked on the door labeled Margot Shargrove, Head of Facility. "Come in," came a low, slightly husky voice. Margot Shargrove sat behind a massive desk, looking through some documents. 54 years had not broken her posture. She held herself upright, emphasizing her natural stateliness. Her short, carefully styled hair, with its graying, framed a face with sharp but attractive features. Her dark blue suit sat flawlessly on her tall figure. "Prisoner Nesiuk, ma'am," Claire reported. "Thank you. You may go," Margot replied without looking up from her papers. When the door closed, the supervisor finally looked at Lucia. Her eyes, dark brown, almost black, scrutinized the woman standing before her. "Have a seat, Nesiuk." Lucia lowered herself gracefully into a chair, maintaining perfect posture. Her orange prison uniform was immaculately clean and ironed, a privilege of working in the laundry. "Do you know why I called you in?" Margot asked, putting her papers aside. "No, ma'am," Lucia lied, lowering her eyes. "I received information about drug smuggling in Block C. The source wished to remain anonymous, but the description of the operation is so detailed that only someone on the inside could have written it." Lucia remained silent, letting Margot draw her own conclusions. "You work in the laundry room. Laundry from all the units passes through it. You might have noticed something suspicious." "I prefer not to meddle in other people's business, ma'am," Lucia said quietly, looking up at her supervisor. "But sometimes safety is more important." Their eyes met, and Lucia saw a glimmer of interest in those dark pools. Margot Shargrove wasn't used to such a direct look from the prisoners. "Security is more important than what?" the warden asked. "Personal principles, ma'am. I'm doing my time and I want to do it safely. Drugs create a dangerous environment for everyone." Margot leaned back in her chair as she continued to study Lucia. Something about this prisoner was different from the others, a particular way of holding herself, speaking, looking. "I'll check the information. If it checks out, it will be credited in your favor." "Thank you, ma'am. Anything else you'd like to report?" Lucia tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question, then smiled, barely perceptible, but enough for Margot to notice. Only that I appreciate the order and discipline you maintain at Dewey Beach, ma'am. Not all agency heads handle it so professional. The compliment was subtle but accurate. Margot was known for her integrity and rigor, which had made her a career in a male-dominated system. You may go, Naseuk, and remember, I have eyes and ears everywhere within these walls. I'm counting on it, ma'am, Lucia replied, rising from her chair. As the door closed behind the prisoner, Margot tapped her pen on the desk thoughtfully. There was something about this woman that attracted and alarmed her at the same time. Perhaps she should have kept her close, at least for observation. That same day, toward evening, Dr. Hanton Shargrove arrived at the prison for a routine medical examination of a group of newly arrived prisoners. A tall, trim man of 56, with short-cropped graying hair and a penetrating gaze, he was known as one of the best surgeons in the state. His voluntary work as a counselor at the prison commanded the respect of his colleagues, though few knew the true reasons. "Good evening, Margot," he said, as he entered his wife's office after completing his examinations. As usual, a disappointing picture. 2 with hepatitis, 1 with suspected tuberculosis. Mara would handle their treatment. Margot nodded, keeping her eyes on the computer. "Thank you, Hanton." "Leave the report on the desk." He put down the file folder and sat down on the edge of the desk, a gesture only he allowed himself. "Today is the anniversary of our arrangement, in case you've forgotten. 5 years of sham marriage." Margot finally pulled herself away from the monitor. "I remember. Dinner at the Blue Clam at 8 o'clock. I won't be late." Hanton smiled with just his lips. "The public needs to see the happy couple. Your promotion to warden and my appointment as head of the surgical ward all require a certain image." "Don't remind me," Margot replied dryly. "The offer to live apart came from you, not from me. And we both know why," Hanton said quietly. "You never loved me as I loved you. But friendship and mutual benefit are not bad things, are they?" Margot remained silent. Their marriage had begun as a passionate affair 20 years ago, but had cooled quickly. For the past 5 years, they had lived apart, keeping the appearance of a relationship for the sake of their careers. Hanton had his hobbies on the side. Margot immersed herself in her work, avoiding her personal life. "See you tonight," Hanton said as he headed for the door. "And please wear that blue dress. It looks great on you." Tamara Hilliston was finishing her shift in the prison's medical unit. A young nurse of 38, she was in her 4th year here, having earned the respect of her colleagues with her professionalism and calm demeanor. "Had Dr. Shargrove finished his exams?" she asked her colleague who was taking in the newcomers. "Yes, he just left. As usual, quick and to the point." Tamara nodded. She respected Hanton as a doctor. Though she found his marriage to the warden odd, they seemed like such different people. As she gathered her things, she noticed Lucia Naseuk entering the infirmary with a basket of fresh laundry. "Good evening, Miss Hilliston," the prisoner said affably. "Brought clean sheets and towels." "Thank you, Lucia. You can leave them by the closet." Tamara watched Naseuk fold the linens neatly on the shelf. Something about this prisoner had always struck her as unusual, maybe a grace of movement or an intelligence of speech that was rare in Dewey Beach. At that moment, Margot Shargrove entered the infirmary. When she noticed Lucia, she slowed her step slightly, almost imperceptibly to the others, but not to Tamara's scrutiny. "Miss Hilliston, I need Johnson's test results," the supervisor said in an official tone. "Of course, ma'am. They're ready. I'll get them right away." As Tamara searched for the right folder, she caught a glimpse of Margot's quick glance at Lucia, and she nodded faintly in response. The silent exchange lasted a second, but Tamara sensed something unusual about it, some hidden intimacy that had nothing to do with the usual interaction between warden and prisoner. For the next 2 weeks, Lucia continued her carefully planned game. She made regular deliveries of laundry to the administration wing, lingering in Margot's office on the pretense of cleaning. Their conversations began by discussing prison matters, but gradually became more personal. "Did you graduate from Harvard?" Lucia asked one day, noticing the diploma on the wall. "That's impressive." "Law school," Margot replied, watching Lucia wipe down the bookshelves. "And you?" 2 years at Yale, economics. Then business went south and I dropped out. That's a shame." "What went wrong?" Margot asked, leaning back in her chair. Lucia turned to her, holding a dustcloth. Ambition got ahead of morality. Classic story. Their eyes met, and something flashed between them. Recognition, understanding. After a day's work, Margot returned to her empty house, thinking more and more of Lucia. This prisoner was different, educated, intelligent, with a special magnetism. Years of loneliness and emotional isolation had made Margot vulnerable to such attention. One evening, staying late in her office, Margot heard a knock on the door. It was Lucia with a folder of papers. "Miss Jones in the clerk's office asked for these reports, ma'am," she said, holding out the folder. Margot took the documents, their fingers touching for a moment. She felt an electric wave run through her body. "It's getting late," Margot said. "Why aren't you in your cell block yet?" "I have special permission until 22 o'clock, Lucia answered with a slight smile. "Work in the laundry room sometimes drags on." They were alone in the study. It was dark outside the window, and the table lamp created an intimate glow. "You do realize what you're doing, don't you, Lucia?" Margot asked quietly, looking her straight in the eye. "Absolutely, ma'am," Lucia answered, stepping forward. "The question is, do you understand? This evening has changed everything." What had begun as a carefully planned manipulation on Lucia's part had turned into a dangerous game for both women. Their meetings became more and more frequent, in an empty conference room, in the archives, in Margot's private office after hours. Lucia had been promoted to her boss's personal assistant for document management, a formality that allowed them to spend more time together without suspicion. But some people did begin to notice the oddities. Tamara Hilliston, shrewd and observant by nature, had seen Margot's behavior change, a softer tone of voice in Lucia's presence, a delay in her gaze, a barely perceptible smile appearing on her usually stern face. Once, while bringing documents into her boss's office, she found Margot and Lucia standing too close to each other. They had recoiled at her appearance, but Tamara could see the intimacy of the moment. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, leaving the folder on the desk. "The tests you requested, ma'am." "Thank you, Miss Hilliston," Margot replied in a formal tone, but the slight blush on her cheeks spoke volumes. As she left the office, Tamara heard Lucia's quiet laughter and felt a prick of unease. Whatever was going on between the warden and the prisoner could have serious consequences for both of them. By the end of their second month of secret meetings, Margot Shargrove realized that she had completely lost control of the situation. All her life, she had prided herself on her iron discipline and unwavering self-control, which had enabled her to rise through the ranks in a correctional system where women had to work twice as hard as men. Now that discipline was crumbling like a house of cards under the influence of Lucia Nasiuk's glances and touches. They met more and more often after hours, when the main staff had left the administration wing. Margot found increasingly elaborate excuses to be alone with Lucia. Sometimes they met in the small lounge behind the boss's office, where only the most trusted employees had access. "Do you ever wonder what will happen when I get out of here?" Lucia asked one day, lying in Margot's arms on the narrow couch. "You won't be out for a while," Margot replied, running her fingers through her thick dark hair. "What if I could come out sooner?" Lucia insisted. "If, for example, someone with influence had helped with parole." Margot tensed. "If you're implying that I could—" "I'm just thinking out loud," Lucia interrupted her gently. "Wouldn't you like it if we could date without all these restrictions?" Margot didn't answer, but the thought lodged in her mind like a thorn in her side. She really could influence the parole board's decision. Her recommendations were usually accepted without objection, but to use her official position in such a way— "Let's not talk about it now," she said finally, kissing Lucia. "We have so little time." Lucia smiled and returned the kiss, but there was a calculating coldness in the depths of her eyes that Margot, blinded by her feelings, did not notice. That same day, Henton Shargrove arrived at the prison for his monthly routine checkup. After finishing with his patients, he went into his wife's office as usual. Opening the door after a brief knock, he found an unusual scene. Margot and some inmates standing by a bookcase so close together that it looked out of place when he appeared. They pulled away sharply. "I apologize for the intrusion," Hanton said, hiding his surprise behind a professional smile. "I can come back later." No, Margot replied too quickly. "We're just finishing up. Nasiuk, you can go." We'll finish cataloging the archive tomorrow." Lucia nodded, lowered her eyes, and headed for the exit. As she passed Hanton, she smiled faintly, as if sharing a secret with him. It was an instant, but Hanton, accustomed to noticing details as a surgeon, caught something disturbing in that smile. "A new project?" he asked as the door closed behind the prisoner. "Yes, we're revising the archiving system," Margot replied, taking a seat at the desk. "How did the inspections go?" "Routine," Hanton said, taking a seat across from her. "But I noticed that you look different." "What do you mean?" Margot touched her hair involuntarily. "You've lost weight, and you look tense. A lot of work." She dismissed it. "You know how it is at the end of the quarter, reports, audits." Hanton nodded, but there was something in his eyes that said he didn't fully believe that explanation. "By the way," he continued, "I wanted to invite you to dinner on Saturday. It's the Richardsons' anniversary, and they're having a reception." "I'll try," Margot replied uncertainly. "But I can't promise anything." Hanton looked at his wife carefully. In 20 years of marriage, even with the last 5 years of sham relationships, he had learned to read her like an open book. Now she was clearly hiding something. "Are you all right, Margot?" he asked directly. "If there's something going on—" "I'm fine," she interrupted. "I really am. Just tired." He nodded, deciding not to insist. After saying goodbye, Hanton left the office, but the uneasiness remained. On his way out of the prison, he ran into Tamara Hilliston. "Dr. Shargrove," she nodded. "Leaving already?" "Yeah, done for the day," he replied. "How are you doing, Tamara? Is your sister still on the force?" "Yes, Zilla is a detective now. She likes it a lot. Give her my regards. By the way," he added casually, "have you noticed anything unusual about Margot's behavior lately?" Tamara hesitated, obviously choosing her words. "Well, she's been coming to the prison more often in the evenings, and she's smiling more, I guess." "Is that so?" Henton raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting. Well, that's good, if she's finally found a reason to smile." Saying goodbye to Tamara, he walked out to the parking lot, where a black Lexus was waiting for him. Getting behind the wheel, Henton wondered what could have caused such a change in his wife's behavior, and the image of the smiling prisoner never left his mind. 2 weeks later, Margot woke up feeling chilled and weak. Writing it off as stress and sleep deprivation, she forced herself to go to work. By lunchtime, however, her condition had deteriorated to the point where even the always collected Margot couldn't concentrate on her paperwork. "You don't look well, ma'am," Lucia said as she brought in another stack of papers. "Maybe you should see a doctor." "It's just fatigue," Margot dismissed it, but her pallor and the sweat on her forehead said otherwise. "Let me get you some tea," Lucia insisted, and there was a genuine concern in her voice that made Margot soften. By evening, the fever had gotten worse, and at Lucia's insistence, Margot still went to a private clinic in a neighboring town where she was unknown. A standard blood test was supposed to show the cause of the fever. The results came back 3 days later and were shocking: positive HIV status. Margot sat in the doctor's office, feeling the ground slipping from under her feet. "It's impossible," she whispered. "There must be a mistake." "We've rechecked the results, Mrs. Shargrove," the doctor said softly. "There is no mistake. But modern antiretroviral therapy allows—" The doctor's voice became a distant noise. Margot thought of only one thing: how? Hanton, for all the flaws in their relationship, couldn't be the source. She hadn't been intimate with her husband in years. The only sexual contact she'd had in recent months had been with Lucia. Back at the prison, Margot immediately summoned the inmate to her office. When Lucia entered with her usual graceful smile, Margot felt a wave of rage rising within her. "Close the door," she ordered in a dry, lifeless voice. Lucia obeyed, and there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Is something wrong?" Margot silently placed the paper with the test results on the table. Lucia looked at it and froze. "You knew." Not a question, but a statement. Lucia slowly raised her eyes, and there was no warmth or tenderness in them, only cold calculation. "Of course I knew," she answered calmly. "I've been living with it for 4 years." "And you deliberately—" Margot couldn't finish the sentence. "Did I deliberately infect you?" Lucia shrugged her shoulders. Let's just say I didn't do anything to avoid it." Margot felt the room begin to spin before her eyes. "Why?" was all she could squeeze out. "Insurance," Lucia answered simply. "I need parole, Margot, and now I have a guarantee that you'll help me." "You," Margot gasped with rage and the pain of betrayal. "You used me!" "And you didn't use me?" Lucia parried. "Didn't you use your power to get what you wanted? We were just playing different games." Margot clenched her fists so hard that her nails dug into her palms. "I will destroy you," she hissed. "You'll rot in solitary confinement for the rest of your sentence." "I don't think so," Lucia replied calmly. "Because if you try anything against me, I'll tell everyone about our little affair. Imagine the headlines: Warden seduced by inmate. Your career, your reputation, everything would be destroyed. I'll also tell about how you falsified prison inspection reports. Yes, I saw the documents on your desk." Margot turned even paler. "What do you want?" "I already told you, early release. You'll write a letter of recommendation to the board. Good behavior, remorse, active participation in prison life, and I'll be out of here in 3 months." "And my diagnosis?" Margot asked bitterly. "How will you compensate for it?" "I don't," Lucia shrugged her shoulders. "Consider it the price of your weakness. Everything has a price, Margot, even love." With these words, she left the office, leaving Margot in a state of near collapse. The next days passed like a blur. Margot avoided Lucia, but every time she ran into her in the corridors, she caught a mocking glance. The stress and antiretroviral therapy were wearing her down, and her colleagues began to notice changes in her appearance and behavior. Hanton, arriving for another visit, was shocked to see his wife. "What's going on with you?" he asked directly, closing the office door. "You look sick." Margot looked at her husband, with whom she had lived most of her life, and suddenly felt that she could no longer carry this burden alone. "Hanton," she began, and her voice trembled. "I have something to confess to you." And she told everything: the affair with Lucia, the diagnosis, the blackmail. To her surprise, Hanton listened to her without judgment, only his face grew increasingly grim. "I'll help you," he said when she finished her confession. "First, as a doctor, we need to confirm the diagnosis and start the right treatment. Secondly, this woman should not go free. But if I don't help her with her parole, she'll tell everything," Margot said helplessly. "Leave it to me," Hanton said firmly. "I have connections in the prison system. We'll find a way to neutralize her threats." That night, alone, Margot felt relieved for the first time in years. Maybe with Hanton's help, she could get out of this situation. But the next day, things got worse. Lucia passed her a note through one of her co-workers. "I know about the conversation with my husband. I have information about him too. Experimental operations without the patient's consent is a serious charge. Meet me today at 20 o'clock in the archives." Margot felt a cold dread gripping her heart. She didn't know about Hanton's experiments, but if Lucia was telling the truth, it could mean not only the end of his career but jail time. That evening, in the empty archive room, Lucia looked calm and confident, unlike an exhausted Margot. "Where did you get your information about Hanton?" Margot asked at once. "I have many sources," Lucia smiled. "One of the nurses at his hospital is an old friend of mine. She told me a lot about Dr. Shargrove's innovative methods that he uses without proper paperwork." "What do you want?" Margot asked tiredly. "The same thing I wanted before, freedom. But now I want assurances from both of you. No attempts to stop me." Margot relayed the conversation to her husband, and for the first time in her memory, Hanton looked genuinely frightened. "She's bluffing," he said uncertainly. "There's no way she knows." She named the patients. "Hanton, what were you doing?" He looked away. "I was developing a new technique for heart valve surgery. It really saves lives, but, the approval process takes years, and some patients didn't have any." "Jesus, Hanton," Margot whispered. "Do you realize that she could destroy us both?" That night, sitting in his office at the hospital, Hanton made a decision. He couldn't let Lucia Nasuk ruin their lives. As a doctor, he'd taken an oath to do no harm, but now it was about survival. His, Margot's, and the dozens of patients his experimental technique had helped. A plan formed quickly. As the prison's consulting physician, he had access to medication and knew the location of the security cameras. 3 days later, he had an overnight visit scheduled to examine an inmate with a heart attack. It was perfect timing. On the night of the murder, Henton arrived at the prison around 23 o'clock. After examining the patient and stabilizing her condition, he delayed, citing the need to fill out paperwork. After waiting for the guard to go on his rounds, Henton went not to the exit but to the cell block where Lucia was being held. Because of his status and good relations with the staff, he passed through several posts unhindered. He had with him a medical case containing a drug that could not be detected in a normal autopsy, a cardiac toxin that caused symptoms similar to natural cardiac arrest. Lucia was asleep when Henton quietly opened her cell door. She didn't even have time to realize what was happening when she felt a prick in her neck. Her eyes flew open in horror, but it was too late. The toxin had acted quickly. "This is the price of your games," Henton whispered as he watched the life leave the body of the woman who had ruined her and Margot's lives. Once he was sure Lucia was dead, he carefully laid her body down as if she had died in her sleep, and just as quietly left the cell. On his way out, he bumped into a guard. "Leaving already, doctor?" he asked. "Yes, the patient is stable," Henton replied calmly. "Tell Miss Hilliston I've left a recommendation for treatment." The guard nodded, and Henton left the prison. Dewey Beach Jail was awakened by the piercing scream of a guard who discovered the lifeless body of Lucia Neseuk during the morning inspection. The prisoner was lying on a narrow bunk, as if in a deep sleep. No visible injuries, a peaceful expression on her face. But her skin had already taken on a waxy tint, and her body was stiff. Tamara Hilliston, on duty in the medical unit that night, was the first to arrive on the scene. After taking one look at Lucia, she realized that help was no longer needed. Nevertheless, acting on protocol, Tamara checked her pulse and pupils, officially pronouncing her dead. "Looks like cardiac arrest," she told the guard. "Judging by the degree of rigor mortis, death was about 2 to 3 hours ago." Tamara continued her examination, automatically checking the body for any traces. Turning Lucia's head, she noticed a tiny red dot on her neck, barely recognizable against the dark skin. It could have been anything, an insect bite, a minor injury. But something about the location of the dot made Tamara wary. She didn't tell anyone about her observation, deciding to talk to her sister first. Zilla Hilliston, homicide detective for the Dewey Beach Police Department, should have been the first to know. At the jail, meanwhile, news of Lucia's death spread instantly. By 8 a.m., the medical examiner and prosecutors arrived. The initial conclusion: natural death, presumably due to heart failure. The body was taken for autopsy and the cell was sealed. Margot Shargrove arrived at the prison earlier than usual, having received a call from the duty officer. Her face expressed nothing but professional concern, but inside a hurricane of conflicting emotions raged. Relief that the threat was over was mixed with shock at what had happened and fear of possible exposure. "I want all of Neseuk's prisoner files on my desk," she ordered, "and prepare a list of everyone who had contact with her in the last 48 hours. Back in her office, Margot closed the door and allowed herself to exhale for the first time that morning. Her hands shook as she dialed Henton's number. "She's dead," Margot said quietly, making sure no one could hear her. "They found her this morning. They said heart failure." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry," Henton finally said in a colorless voice. "But maybe it's best for everyone." "I didn't want this," Margot whispered. "No one wanted it," Henton replied. "But what's done is done. The important thing now is to stay calm." Margot nodded, forgetting that her husband couldn't see her, and hung up. Detective Zilla Hilliston got the call as she was returning from another case. A short, trim woman of 42 with short-cropped curly hair, she had a reputation as one of the best detectives in the department. She was especially good at cases that required attention to psychological nuances. "Women's prison?" she asked after listening to the dispatcher. "Why homicide? It's a natural death." "The D.A.S office has requested an additional review," came the reply. "Standard procedure for deaths in custody." When Zilla arrived at the prison, the first thing she did was look at Lucia's cell. The small room was kept remarkably clean. Books neatly arranged on a shelf, clothes folded, photographs pinned to the wall above the bed. She wasn't like the other prisoners, the guard accompanying Zilla said. Always kept to herself, but polite. Lately, she'd been working as the warden's personal assistant. Personal assistant? Zilla raised an eyebrow. An unusual assignment for a prisoner. Miss Shargrove said she needed someone with organizational skills to handle the archives. Nesyuk was educated with a background in economics. Zilla nodded, making notes in her notebook. Something about this story was already starting to alarm her. The next stop was the morgue, where the medical examiner, Dr. Reeves, had just begun the autopsy. Zilla watched the procedure while studying the preliminary report. No outward signs of violence, Reeves commented. Healthy young woman, good physical condition, not a typical case for sudden cardiac arrest. What about toxicology? Zilla asked. We'll have the results in a couple days, but preliminarily, nothing suspicious. That evening, Zilla met her sister at a small cafe near the police station. Tamara was already waiting for her, nervously tapping her fingers on a cup of cold coffee. I found something, she said instead of greeting. There was a puncture mark on Nesyuk's neck. Small, almost imperceptible. Zilla stepped forward. Are you sure? Absolutely. In 15 years in medicine, I've learned to recognize these things. It was a professional injection exactly in the jugular vein, where the mark is almost imperceptible. Did you report it? No. Tamara shook her head. I wanted to talk to you first. Things are very strange there, Zilla. Dr. Shargrove, the warden's husband, was at the prison that night. He was visiting a patient with a heart attack, and also... Tamara hesitated. Something had been going on between Nesyuk and Margot Shargrove in recent months. In what way? I'm not sure, but Lucia was always in her boss's office. They spent a lot of time together, sometimes late at night, and the looks they exchanged... Zilla nodded slowly, putting the picture together in her head. Thank you, Tamara. I'll look into it. But don't say a word to anyone for now. The next day, Zilla requested the prison's security footage from the night of Lucia's death. Most of it was standard. Nighttime guard shifts, silence in the hallways, Dr. Shargrove's arrival at 22 hours and 30 minutes to provide emergency care for an inmate having a heart attack. But then, Zilla noticed an inconsistency. There was a 20-minute gap in the records, between 2 hours and 15 minutes and 2 hours and 35 minutes of the night. A technical glitch, as the guard in charge of the records explained. It sometimes happened with power surges. Zilla couldn't believe the coincidence. According to Tamara's report, Lucia's death had occurred around the same time. The next step was to talk to Margot Shargrove. The warden welcomed the detective into her office, keeping a very formal demeanor. How can I help the homicide department? She asked when Zilla introduced herself. This is a natural death, after all. We're still considering all leads, Miss Shargrove, Zilla replied calmly. Tell us about your interaction with Lucia Nesyuk. Margot tensed subtly. Standard working relationship. She helped with the archiving of documents. She was competent and efficient. Unusual for a warden to have an inmate as a personal assistant, isn't it? It might be. But we're short-staffed and she had the skills. Zilla studied Margot's face, noting the micro-expressions, the slight twitching of her eyelids, the tension at the corners of her lips. Did anyone have reason to want Nesyuk dead? I don't think so, Margot answered too quickly. She wasn't in conflict with the other prisoners. What about you, Miss Shargrove? Did you have any conflicts with her? Margot held the detective's gaze. No conflicts, Detective Hilliston. Just a working relationship. The conversation with Hanton Shargrove took place in his office at the hospital, a spacious room overlooking the city park and walls hung with diplomas and certificates. Of course I was in jail that night, he confirmed, looking at Zilla over his glasses. Emergency call to a patient with an arrhythmia. Stabilized her and left. What time did you leave the prison? Hanton thought for a moment. About 23 hours and 30 minutes. You can check the visitor's log. I will, Zilla nodded. Did you know the prisoner Lucia Nesyuk? Only by name. I heard from my wife that she was a file clerk. You didn't examine her as a doctor? No. Hanton shook his head. Never. Zilla scrutinized the doctor's face. Unlike Margot, he was calmer, more confident. But there was something in his eyes, a slight wariness, an overly intense gaze that made her suspicious. Back at the station, Zilla immersed herself in studying the case file. Lucia Nasuk's story was beginning to emerge. A brilliant start to a career in finance, then a major fraud, arrest, conviction, in prison, good behavior, a job in a laundry, then a promotion to assistant boss. I got a call this evening from Dr. Reeves. "Detective, I have some unusual toxicology results," he said without preamble. "There were traces of succinylcholine in Nasuk's blood." "What's that?" "It's a myorelaxant used in anesthesiology. In large doses, it causes respiratory paralysis and cardiac arrest. It breaks down in the body in minutes, so it's extremely difficult to detect. We're lucky the blood samples were taken right after death." "Are you sure it's a homicide?" "Absolutely." And the killer knew what he was doing. This substance is only available to medical professionals. Zilla thanked the expert and hung up. Now she was certain Lucia Nasuk had been murdered, and the circle of suspects was narrowed down to people with medical training who had access to the prison on the night of the murder. The next day, Zilla received another important piece of information. An employee of a private clinic in a neighboring town, promising confidentiality, said that a week before Lucia's death, Margot Shargrove had taken tests there that showed a positive HIV status. A picture began to emerge. Zilla requested Lucia's medical records and found that information about her HIV status was missing, an unusual omission for prison records. A new conversation with Tamara brought additional details. "Lucia regularly received some medication from a friend during visits," said Tamara. "I didn't pay much attention to it. I thought it was vitamins or something like that. But now I realize it could have been antiretroviral drugs." "Did Margot know?" "I don't think so. Until recently. About a week before Lucia died, they had a terrible row in their office. I was walking by and I heard screaming. Margot was yelling something like, 'You ruined my life.'" Zilla nodded, taking notes. "What about Hanton? How's his relationship with his wife?" "Strange," Tamara shrugged. "Everyone knows they're separated, even though they're officially married. But lately he's been showing up at the prison more often, not just to see patients. They were having a serious conversation with Margot." "The night Lucia died, was Henton really examining a heart attack patient?" Tamara thought for a moment. "Yes, he came to see Jenkins with an arrhythmia, stabilized her condition. But then," she frowned, "then he said he'd be late to fill out paperwork. He usually does that on the spot, right after the exam." "And what time did he leave?" "I don't know exactly. I was called to another cell block at about 23 o'clock. When I came back around 2 in the morning, he was gone." Zilla looked at her sister with gratitude. "Thank you, Tamara. You've been very helpful." The next day, Zilla obtained a warrant to seize the prison's visitor logs. According to the record, Henton Shargrove left the facility at 23 hours and 45 minutes into the day. But the guard who made the recording could not accurately recall whether he actually saw the doctor leave or simply noted the time his alleged visit ended. Another check of the security cameras at the prison's exit showed that the recording was missing the moment Hanton left the building. Again, a technical glitch. Zilla requested a search warrant for Henton Shargrove's home and office. In his desk drawer, they found ampoules of succinylcholine, the same drug found in Lucia's blood, and in the glove compartment of his car, disposable syringes similar to those used in hospitals. With this evidence, Zilla went to see Hanton again, this time not alone, but with 2 police officers. "Dr. Shargrove," she began when they were alone in his office, "I have every reason to believe that you murdered Lucia Nasuk." Hanton looked at her calmly, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "What grounds, detective?" "Succinylcholine in her blood, same drug in your office, a puncture mark on her neck that could only have been administered by a trained medical professional, your presence in prison the night of the murder, and, of course, the motive, protecting your wife from blackmail and a scandal that would have destroyed both your careers." Hanton was silent for a long minute, then sighed. "Have you spoken to Margot?" "Yes. She still denies having an affair with Lucia, but the medical tests speak for themselves." "Margot doesn't know," Hanton said quietly. "She didn't ask me to do this. I acted on my own." "Why?" "She gave my wife a fatal disease." Hanton's voice trembled. "Deliberately. and she used it to blackmail me, threatened to ruin not only Margot's career, but mine as well. She had information about my unofficial medical practices. Experimental surgeries without patient consent? Hanton shuddered. You're well informed. It's my job, Zilla shrugged. So you admit to killing Lucia Nasiuk? Hanton covered his eyes. Yes, I did it. I used succinylcholine, knowing it would cause cardiac arrest and decompose quickly in the body. I was counting on it to be a natural death. But you left out a small detail, a puncture mark that my sister noticed. Tamara was always attentive. Hanton smiled weakly. When she first started working at the hospital, I told her she'd make an excellent diagnostician. Zilla nodded to the two officers waiting outside the door. Hanton Shargrove, you are under arrest for the murder of Lucia Nasiuk. When the handcuffs clicked on Hanton's wrists, he looked almost relieved, as if the weight he had been carrying for the past few days had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The epilogue to the Lucia Nasiuk case was bittersweet for everyone involved in the drama. Hanton Shargrove pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence and received 20 years in prison with parole eligibility in 15. His medical license was revoked. Margot Shargrove resigned as warden, although she was not formally charged with accessory to murder. Her professional reputation was ruined and her positive HIV status required ongoing treatment. Tamara Hilliston continued to work at the prison hospital, but her relationship with her sister became strained. Zilla felt that Tamara should have reported her suspicions earlier. Zilla Hilliston herself had been promoted to senior detective, but the taste of that victory was bitter. Too many lives had been ruined in this story, too much pain inflicted. And Lucia Nasiuk, whose manipulative game had led to this finale, was buried in Dewey Beach City Cemetery in an unmarked grave that no one visited. The only reminder of her existence is a thin file of case files in the police department archives.